Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Stefan. I will be your host today. And this webinar is part of a series that we're doing during the coronavirus epidemic. We're doing this webinar every week, every Wednesday morning, to try to stay in touch with our customers, our partners, and other industry peers. So thanks once again for joining. Today I'm going to take you through our threat matrix report. We're going to talk about the latest malware trends and the latest real-world scenarios that our cybersecurity specialists are seeing. I hope that you can hear me well. I hope that you can see the slides. This is the agenda for today. We're going to talk about threat landscape. I'm going to give you some insights in the latest developments in the cybercrime that we're seeing. We're going to discuss some real world scenarios, and then we're going to wrap it up with some conclusions. To jump right in, a couple of words about CSIS. We're a private security company based in Copenhagen, Denmark. We have more than 70 employees from 25 nationalities. We're doing threat intelligence, and we're mostly working with the financial sector. We're the proud hosts of the Copenhagen Cybercrime Conference, and we're proud to be credited by the Gartner Group for our actionable and exceptional threat intelligence capabilities. Now, to tell you a little bit about myself, I've been doing security research for more than 10 years now. I'm based in Bucharest, Romania. I did a lot of APT research at Kaspersky Lab. Then I did automotive security in Exia. And together with my former colleague Gabriel, we were named the Internet Doctors by Forbes. Now, we were very proud to be named Internet Doctors back then, but nowadays during the pandemic times, looking at the risk and the exposure that the actual medical doctors are having, trying to save our lives, I think that cybersecurity is, of course, something that we need, but maybe calling ourselves doctors is a bit too much. So anyway, make sure to follow me on Twitter, Stefan T. I usually like to share things about security and latest updates and the latest trends. And nowadays that we are not allowed to get out of the house, I found myself looking in old pictures from work, from vacations, and I realized that many people, they don't really know exactly how it feels to be a security researcher, because people usually think that being a security researcher means spending time in front of your screen, maybe working on something that looks boring from the outside. But where you're actually in the trenches, fighting with the latest malware and the latest threats, the way that you feel is more like this. It's more like being in a corrida, fighting a real bull, and actually feeling the adrenaline, from doing the cyber fight. I'm hearing that there's some sound problems. I hope that you can hear me well. Actually, is this better now? I hope. Let me check the microphone. Yeah, there it goes. Perfect. So, threat matrix, the latest malware trends. What is the threat matrix? Threat matrix basically is a report that CSIS is putting out every 6 months. And from our point of view, it's a must-read publication. It's a document that describes the ever-evolving threat landscape, the latest trends in cybersecurity. We're talking here about the cybercrime developments that we're seeing, the connection with the APT world, advanced persistent threats, cyber espionage, and of course, updates from the mobile malware world, the phishing world. And probably the most important part is the lessons learned by our incident response teams, by our cybersecurity consultants, when they work with customers, when they do forensics and incident response. So this is a very valuable piece of threat intelligence that I recommend you to follow. We already shared this report with our customers around the world, and soon we're going to make it public. So during this webinar, you're going to get an exclusive insight with the most interesting things that we have put together in this report. Um, when we look at the past 6 months, one way to describe what happened is to look at the numbers. And we have plenty of statistics and really relevant data put in the report. I tried to select some of them here. For example, 97% of the financial services professionals say they worry about the third-party risk. This is the supply chain attacks that we've been talking about more and more lately. 2/3 of ransomware infections are originating from email campaigns, basically spam and phishing. Which means that protecting our emails is something very relevant right now. And again, almost half of the victims of ransomware had to pay the ransom to get their data back, which shows how big this threat is. And of course, the numbers are big. The average losses from a data breach are ranging right now to almost $4 million. And we're seeing, in countries like Denmark, for example, we're seeing thousands of new reports to the police regarding financial cybercrime. So we live in an interesting world. The effects of the coronavirus pandemic are, of course, also being noticed. And Jan, my colleague, is taking you through those developments in the other webinars that we're doing. But yeah, essentially looking at this threat matrix report, we're seeing a few developments, and these are the key things that I want you to remember after this webinar. First of all, the fact that cybercrime and APT are not two totally separate things anymore. With the highly successful developments that we've seen in the TrickBot campaigns, starting to work with other cyber espionage groups, this means that the line between cybercrime and APTs is becoming more and more blurred. And it's, the traditional way in which cybercrime was only interested in money and APT was only interested in espionage is not the way that things are happening anymore. We're seeing more and more cybercrime actors interested in data, and we're seeing more and more APT actors interested in financial gains. Of course, one of the ways to do these financial gains is to target the financial system. The other way is to target organizations with ransomware. And we're seeing ransomware becoming more effective and more targeted lately. We're seeing enterprise level cyber extortion, in which the data is not only encrypted, but is also exfiltrated, and then the attackers are threatening the victim to make the data public unless the ransom is paid. I'm going to take you through some examples of these. MageCart, which was the topic of my last webinar 2 weeks ago, which shows the current supply chain vulnerability and the third-party risk that is becoming more and more relevant nowadays. And at the end, I'm going to show you some examples of the new mobile malware that we're seeing targeting Android, and why protecting our emails is very relevant nowadays. So essentially, all the good things, all the takeaways that our consultants and experts have seen in the last 6 months are present in this report. And we can start by looking at the malware trends, because malware is something that keeps evolving. And probably the most dangerous threat out there to organizations worldwide is still TrickBot, which is one of the, let's say, history's most successful cybercrime operations. It's targeting organizations worldwide, but of course, focus remains in United States and Western Europe, countries like Spain or the United Kingdom. TrickBot is becoming more and more modular in their operation. Right now, they're fine-tuning heavily, depending on the target that they are hitting. We've seen some very important updates made to the malware in the past few months, most notably the Trick Booster module, that is essentially a credential stealing module that also acts as a spam bot, helping to deliver TrickBot to the victim's contact list, making the chance of the infection higher. And last but not least, the fileless injection method that we've witnessed happening on Windows 10 64 bits, which is again something that shows how these threats keep evolving from a technical point of view, becoming more and more sophisticated. And this, of course, shows on the business side of things when talking about monetization. TrickBot is known as a group to work with other cybercrime groups to essentially give them access to victims that TrickBot has already infected. And one of the most notable developments in the last few months was that it became public the fact that TrickBot has worked together with Lazarus Group, which has been publicly attributed to North Korea by the US government, to essentially give Lazarus access to victims already infected by TrickBot based in Europe and North America. And I think this is one of the main developments that we're seeing in cybercrime right now. The fact that cybercrime is becoming so successful that some cybercrime groups are starting to work together with nation state sponsored threat actors. Emotet is another threat that we are heavily monitoring because it's something that is currently affecting lots of internet users. We are seeing after the break, the summer break last year, we saw Emotet increase activity right when autumn started. So essentially these guys came back from hibernation, they came back from vacation, and they restarted their campaigns, even though the United States government publicly indicted a couple of individuals related to the Dridex Trojan and put a $5 million bounty on any information that could lead to the arrest of the group members. They restarted the activity with large-scale email spam campaigns. They added an interesting module that gives them the ability to hijack ongoing email conversations between the victim and their contacts, which gives them plenty of opportunity to do fraud like BEC fraud, CEO fraud, essentially injecting yourself as an attacker in the middle of a conversation without having to use a type of squatted domain by essentially relying on the victim's email system is a very powerful tool. And of course, they continue dropping other pieces of malware in the second stage, things like QBot or Dridex or RSNF. TrickBot has, of course, already also been seen. And then in a later stage, ransomware, things like Ryuk or BitPaymer. Maybe the most notable development in the Emotet game was the new module that gives Emotet the capability of spreading itself through the Wi-Fi cards of the victim computers. This is something that is not very common in the cybercrime world. Of course, there's academic papers and papers at conferences like Black Hat or DEF CON where researchers show methods of having malware jump from one device to another by exploiting the physical space, right, around the computer. But actually seeing this being done in the wild by a threat actor that is as big and dangerous as Emotet is something that is worthwhile to be noted. And essentially what Emotet is doing, it's abusing the Wi-Fi card of a victim computer to scan for other Wi-Fi networks around it, brute force the passwords to these networks, and then use this new access to the neighborhood networks as an infection vector to make the spreading go further. So you can imagine, especially during nowadays with so many people working from home and everyone relying on their home Wi-Fi network, this is even more relevant than before. I mentioned that Emotet sometimes drops ransomware in the end. And unfortunately, ransomware is something that is not going to go away anytime soon. It's evolving into a real beast. We're seeing more precise targeting and an overall increased effectiveness of ransomware campaigns in the past 6 months. Essentially, our incident response teams had been called and had to solve cases in which the actors were doing their homework really, really well before attacking. They would understand the victim network very well, and their strikes would be near perfect, meaning that there would be no way to recover from these strikes. Even when backups had been in place, the ransomware was targeting the backups. Also, sometimes the attackers were even choosing specific times of the day, for example, when the IT analysts were having a shift change, or when nobody was looking at the network to essentially start the encryption routine. And probably the most interesting development that we're seeing in the ransomware area is that attackers are paying more and more attention to the data that they are encrypting. This means that in some cases, for example, this is something that the Maze ransomware was doing. Attackers would first steal the data. They would first exfiltrate the data before encrypting it. Then they would move on with encryption, and then they would contact the victim, showing them proof that they still have the data and threatening the victim to make the data public unless the ransom is paid. And especially in the context of GDPR and other data protection legislation that we now have set in place, this is extremely dangerous for victim organizations. In one of the cases, the email that the Maze group sent to the victim organization has become public, and you can see here how they are threatening to send 90% of their data to WikiLeaks unless the ransom is not paid in 2 weeks. This was if I remember correctly, a US-based a victim, but this is what they usually do. They try to publicly shame the victims. They try to threaten the victims into paying for this. And in this specific case, Maze essentially started publishing parts of the data just to push the victim company even further, even harder to make the ransom payment. So this has led the FBI to warn US companies about the Maze ransomware and the fact that the data itself is not only encrypted anymore, but in many cases it can be exfiltrated and then used against the victim company. So this is something very dangerous, and it's a development that's worth noting. And the thing that you need to remember is that if backup was something that could protect you against ransomware in the past, nowadays backup is not enough, because what use is your backup if the cyber criminals also have a backup of that data? I hope that makes sense. On the mobile malware front, we're seeing more info stealers and more scams. Of course, Android still remains the main target because of the fact that it's a more open ecosystem compared to the iOS ecosystem. It's much easier for cyber criminals to develop malware, and not only to develop it, but more importantly, to get that malware to be available on the Google Play Store, which is the official marketplace for Android apps. Usually with Android phones, the biggest risk of infection is when you use third-party marketplaces, when you use APK websites from where you can download, for example, a free version of an otherwise the paid app. But in the cases of malware such as Joker or Mobile, for example, which are we like to call it the next level of mobile fraud, these applications were available in thousands in Google Play Store directly. So it's pretty hard for a regular user to protect himself as long as the malware comes from Google Play Store directly. And unfortunately, despite the efforts put by Google to clean up the Play Store, still malware developers managed to find their way into it. The way that Joker, for example, operated was that after you would install an application which seemed benign, something like a calculator or like a very simple quiz or game, they would silently display a premium offer, but silently means that the user would not actually see it. So they would display it in an invisible frame on the device, a frame that's not visible for the user, but a frame in which the malware can automatically click to confirm that the user accepts the offer, and then essentially enable a recurring monthly payment from the user for that specific subscription. This type of attack is causing real damages to the wallets of the victims, because in many cases, it's really hard for the victim to even realize that the subscription has been enabled unless they check their bank records or unless they check their invoices for the Play Store. It might be several months until the point where the victim realizes that the infection took place. And last but not least, an important development in the mobile malware area was the GIMP mobile banking Trojan, which is essentially an evolution from the Anubis banking Trojan. It's the modified malware client, but more or less the same command and control server. It's been adapted to work on mobile phones, and it's targeting users of financial and cryptocurrency apps. We're seeing various different variants. Our assumption right now is that this malware is still under development. So what we're doing is we're following it closely because it's targeting pretty much from a geographical perspective overlaps our own customer and partnership base. So the last thing I wanted to show you when it comes to malware is the news from the phishing pond. And of course, if you look at the top 10 phishing hosts, please don't mind the Android is still the main target. That's my mistake. But we're seeing changes, little changes in the top 10 phishing hosts. I think what's the most important thing here is that you can see most of the phishing is being hosted on legit hosting providers, cloud services such as Amazon or Google, even reverse proxies such as Cloudflare. And of course, this is very dangerous because it means that it's very hard for some organizations, based on the way that their whitelisting is working, to actually protect against these things. There's many security products who just whitelist blindly, as long as the traffic is coming from let's say a Google IP address or a Cloudflare IP address, because they must know what they're doing. But in many cases, attackers are managing to abuse these services, and even if the security teams of these services, they act really quickly in taking down the malicious content, attackers still have a pretty good window in which they can get their data from the users. If you take a look at the top phished brands, we can see that the list is kind of divided into two parts. It's either banks, financial services, things like Bank of America, PayPal, Wells Fargo, the usual suspects. But also at the same time, big online social media services, websites such as Facebook or Yahoo or Microsoft. So phishing is going on. We're doing a pretty good job with our security NS feed to block these things. But I'd like to take a break from talking about malware and spend a few minutes to take you through what I think is one of the most interesting real-world scenario that we've witnessed in the last few months. And it was a case that involved hacking and extortion. This is why we're saying that hacking and extortion is on the rise. It's not only Maze ransomware, but also more various threat actors. And this is something that we've witnessed in a couple of cases, this new wave of attacks targeting web applications. And essentially what's happening here is that attackers are continuously scanning the public internet space to try to identify weaknesses, logic mistakes, or misconfigurations in web applications. So it's not a question of launching ransomware on your endpoints. It's not a question of launching ransomware on your Active Directory, but more of a question of identifying some web assets that maybe the company even forgot about them, that they're there, open to the internet. Things like weak databases with weak login credentials that can be brute force things like web applications that contain bugs such as SQL injection or other code injection leading to remote code execution. And essentially they're continuously scanning the internet, and once they find a target, an interesting victim, they move on to the second stage. And the second stage is actually the more interesting part of the threat, because that's where they manually go in. They will jump themselves after the automated scan is over, and they would do research about the victim company. They would manually explore the database and the server that they got access to try to understand how valuable is the data stored there. Is there any customer data? Is there any business data? Is there any data that would involve a GDPR fine or a data protection problem? And they would exfiltrate the relevant data. They would essentially dump the whole database and create an offline copy that they possess of the database. And then they would either destroy the data or encrypt the data. The way that each of these stories ends is that the attackers are contacting the victim organization, letting them know that they have access to their business data, and then they would ask for a ransom and threaten that they're going to publish the data unless the ransom is paid. So the things that I want you to remember here is that the lesson learned by us with dealing with these incidents is that organizations nowadays need to increase their focus on securing the supply chain, on managing the third-party risk, because these web properties that we're seeing being targeted by these attackers are essentially external web properties. They are not part of the perimeter of the network. They can be business-to-business portals, marketing websites, online shops that are either created by a third-party provider or they're created internal on old code base. They're missing updates. So yeah, what we recommend is to take a closer look at the logs and try to manage these web properties in a more proactive way, because attackers will use every chance that they get to threaten a company with making such data public. We're getting close to the end of the presentation. We still have 4 minutes left. I just want to show you some statistics. This is from our security analyst service that has blocked millions of requests to malware and command and control servers and the phishing pages in the last 6 months. We're seeing a huge increase in botnet command and control servers compared to the previous year. We're seeing lots of ransomware attacks targeting OpenRDP ports, connections. We're seeing Magenta websites being reinfected with skimmers or sometimes being infected with multiple skimmers. By the way, I didn't focus on MageCart at all during this webinar because we did a MageCart webinar 2 weeks ago, and you can find that on our YouTube channel. Just search for CSIS Security Group on YouTube. If you look at our stats coming from CERC, from the CSIS Incident Response Kit, we can see that remote access Trojans are still the main problem, are still the main tool that attackers are using to essentially get full control over a victim network. And we're talking here about JRAT, RSNF, Emotet, TrickBot, Dridex. Top infection vectors, we're still looking at phishing and spear phishing being responsible for the biggest number and the most dangerous attacks throughout the last 6 months. It's been very helpful to us in all investigations, the cooperation that we have inside SIE Europe, which is a service that's meant to share threat intelligence in a way that protects users' personal data. And the CSIS is proud to be a founding member of this initiative. And just to finalize, I'd like to let you know that this report is not public yet, but if you follow us closely on social media, on places like LinkedIn or Twitter, you will be the first to know when we make this report public. So you're going to have access to all the goodies and all the insights from our experts in the past 6 months. And last but not least, before we end, I just wanted to remind you that during the coronavirus pandemic, we're trying to contribute ourselves also to making the internet a safer place by giving a free trial, no strings attached, to some of our threat intelligence services, to our remote incidents response kit, and our email fraud protection offering. With that in mind, I'd like to thank you so much for paying attention. That's where you can follow me on Twitter. And yeah, let's see if we have questions. I'm gonna open the Q&A. We have one question from the chat. What does TrickBot do? Well, it's we're probably gonna need a new webinar just for explaining what TrickBot does. But essentially, TrickBot is one of the most modern instances of malware responsible for cybercrime. It gives attackers full control over the victim computer. And why TrickBot is so dangerous nowadays is because they take a very modular and very tailored approach to the way that they monetize the victim, meaning that they don't just do mass attacks, even though the infection is based on mass attacks. each attack will be customly tailored, and they would grant access to other groups if there's some victim machines that is not interested to them, or they will explore every possibility to make money out of that, whether it is to engage in financial fraud or to deploy some ransomware, for example. We have one more question. What is the most dangerous threat for small and medium businesses right now? So yeah, it's I understand the question. We try to talk about many things during this this session. So I'm not sure if you're referring to an actual threat or let's say a risk or a danger, but what I would like to say is, except for all this malware and cybercrime activity that's going around, there's things that is making us more unsafe because of our behavior. And one of the common risk factors that we've seen in the past few months when dealing with incidents has been the lack of updates in certain areas of the IT infrastructure. So in the hack and extort cases that I talked to you about, it's been a lack of updates on the part of maintaining the web application. But in other cases, it can be a lack of updates on endpoints or even on important servers in the network. And you know, I would like to use this opportunity to remind you that starting off with January, Microsoft has ended all the active support for Windows 7. I think there's still some payment-based options that you can go for if you still need updates. But what this means is that if you still have machines running Windows 7 in your organizations, it would be a good idea to try to upgrade them. All right. I'd like to thank you all again for joining. Please make sure to follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, and make sure to join our webinar in 1 week. Okay, we have one more question coming up. Fortunately, I think I see it in the Q&A. What can companies do to reduce downtime and or loss of data due to a ransomware attack if backups are being compromised and or the effectiveness of having backups is becoming obsolete as a recovery tool? It's a very good question, and yeah, this is one of the things that I wanted to send as a message during the webinar: the fact that ransomware is becoming more sophisticated, more evolved, and it's becoming harder and harder to recover. So if we're talking about reducing downtime, meaning that meaning recovering more quickly, I think the only thing that we can do is to try to prevent the attack from happening in the first place. Because once the attack has happened, then I think you're out of your own strategy and you just have to respond to the attacker. So I think that the best strategy here would be to prevent the attack in the first place. And I think that there's 3 things that companies need to do for that. First of all is to make sure that everything is updated. Second of all is to make sure that everything is monitored. And I'm talking here about monitoring your internet traffic. I'm talking here about monitoring all of your logs. Ideally, it would be inside a centralized system, or SIM system. And last but not least, user awareness, education. I know it's hard, especially in a small and medium business where there's no fully dedicated IT security person. But ideally, every user should understand some of the cyber risks that they're exposing themselves and their organizations to. I hope that answers the question. So I'd like to thank you all once again for joining this. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel because we're gonna publish this presentation there, and follow us to get the latest version of the threat matrix report. Thank you so much. Stay safe.